Hello and welcome to our Moxy webinar titled Combining Moxy and VO2 for the Full Physiological Picture, presented by Daniel Crumback of Strategic Sport Performance. We will use our typical format today. Daniel will cover about half of his presentation and then we'll stop for a short Q&A. Then Daniel will do the second half and we'll have a longer Q&A at the end. Please type in any questions that you have into the questions panel on the right side of the screen. Daniel has lots of real-world examples, so we aim to be finished up by about 11:50 today, Central Time. That's about 45 or 47 minutes from now. We will send out a recording and post it on the website and on our forum. So if there's any additional questions or comments, you can follow up with that on the forum, which is forum.moxymonitor.com. So with that, Daniel's got a great presentation, so I'm going to turn it over to him. He'll do an introduction of himself to start with.
Thanks, Roger, and thanks to Moxy for this opportunity. It's a real honor to present to you, and I'm really excited about getting the feedback from everybody else out there, as this is a relatively new technology, and we're all just trying to find our way through it. So there's no absolutes as of yet, as I doubt there ever will be. That gentleman there was Jay Kinsella, one of my athletes for the last 2 years, who's been a fervent zone tester with me as well as a SpiroTagger user, and just won the Tahoe 200-mile race last year. So my name is Daniel Crumback. I am I'm completing my master's in rehabilitation science at University of Alberta on the injury prediction for MSK injuries. I'm also a sport physiotherapist and a certified exercise physiologist and strength conditioning specialist. And my company on the side is Strategic Sport Performance, where we help athletes identify and eliminate limitations to performance. My background, I'm a major in the Canadian Armed Forces, have been in the military for 29 years. And I'm looking at retiring this year, so I'm looking at a bunch of options out there. It's kind of exciting. I'm currently the physiotherapy regional practice leader for Western Canada, meaning that all the bases west of Ontario, I'm responsible for the care given to the soldiers in those areas. I've been testing for around 16 years, and I first started off with Jurg when I realized as a young physiotherapist that I didn't know enough about physiology, and I heard about this guy way up in northern BC. Jurg. I sought him out and actually went and drove there and spent a couple of days with Jurg, and was one of the first people using balance point testing along with Jurg, and also I covered even things like ski events and doing on-site testing with Jurg. So I thank him and continue to thank him for his brilliance and his willingness to share with the rest of us, and the progression that he's made in actual physiological testing and program design. Worked a lot in the Okanagan originally. I'm originally from the Okanagan in British Columbia, so I worked with Andrew Sellers and the boys from Balance Point. I also want to give a shout out to Fred Alward. I was also in Halifax and worked side by side with Fit by Fred, who appreciate his intelligence and his innovative approach. He doesn't allow science to get in the way. He uses it for good and not for evil. So a shout out to Fred, and of course I've been lucky enough to work with Andre, Jurg's son, who was about 8-10 years old when I first met him. So I thank Andre in Switzerland for at Swingco for his input on what I do. So my background is I went all the way through doing lactate testing alone, using balance point testing, and then using balance point testing in combination with VO2. The FitMate, and then moving to Moxy and VO2 over the last 16 years. So I've had a chance to use a bunch of different methods, and I can tell you fervently that the Moxy has been the most exciting new device out there, and it is the most accurate device for zoning that I've ever worked with, and I'm absolutely confident in its abilities. I'm also a SpiroTagger competency center for the last 5 years. I've been using SpiroTagger for about 10 years, but have been really working hard over the last 5 years here in Edmonton, Alberta. We also do injury prediction, prevention, treatment, and programming thanks to my sport physiotherapy background. and I work with coaches for athlete and event training program development. I try and work with coaches because I think coaches aren't people who design programs and test people. They're the ones that actually spend time with them on the track, on the road, and developing their skills and developing their strategies towards racing. So I don't consider myself a coach. I just consider myself a physiologist who will work with identifying our limiters and helping with program design. At the facility that I work out of is We Physio in Edmonton, and Craig Brzozowski is a wonderful man who also offers 3D gait analysis and bike fit at the facility. So it's a wonderful combination of services provided in one center. We mainly work, just so you know, age groupers to semi-pro, junior nationals in the Alberta region at this particular time. So that gives you a bit of background on me. My mission and state is to review my testing procedures and how it works for the benefit of those that are not currently using VO2 or respiratory data, to show that zoning with Moxy is good, and that zoning with VO2 respiratory data is now unnecessary. I want to present how to use the analysis of both Moxy or VO2 for a true picture, because at times that you can get some misrepresentation when you're trying to get too much from the Moxy. And inappropriate extrapolation of Moxy results definitely leads to misinterpretation without VO2 or respiratory data. So I could not work without both, in my opinion. Respiratory limitations are real, and I hope to prove that to you and have profound effects on the Moxy results. And respiratory limitations are trainable. So for those that haven't considered the respiratory limitations of their athletes, are not using VO2, once you identify there is something you can actually do about it, they'll make a profound effect. So our goal in most cases with testing is identification of which system is limiting the performance. Of course, there's cardiovascular, neuromuscular, metabolic or cellular, and respiratory. What we do in this particular case with my testing is we go through a pulmonary function test. You're seeing a gentleman here using a PICO 6. It measures forced vital capacity. That's your 6-second volume. So the person takes a deep breath in, does a maximal forced expiration, and the FVC, or forced vital capacity, is a 6-second volume. Looking essentially at the volume that they're capable of using, so capacity. It also measures, the PICO 6 also measures FEV1, so the forced expiratory volume in 1 second, and that looks at the ability to forcefully expire air, which is extremely important when it comes to exercise performance. And what we do is we compare their forced vital capacities with normative data, which is sex, age, height, and race related, in order to determine if there's a limitation. In a lot of cases, I am not finding that people's forced vital capacities are limited unless there's some history. So for example, if they've had, let's say, a rib or thoracic fractures or a clavicular fracture, which is very common with their cyclists, they may have a musculoskeletal limitation that doesn't allow them to be able to fully expand their lungs, or if they've had some issue with their diaphragmatic strength, you might see that their forced vital capacity is actually low, and that needs to be worked on separately. But in most cases, we're looking at the relationship of what percentage comes out in the 1 second of the total 6-second capacity. And what we're looking for in general in our population is greater than 78% should come out in the first 1 second. And the majority of the respiratory limitations I see are expiratory. And that's extremely important to realize when you're looking at other training methods that are out there. Most people can't breathe out. And with that, they'll obviously they'll have old air sitting at the bottom of the lung where most of the alveoli are, and that dead space creates some issues with transfer of O2 across to the hemoglobin. And one of the things we want to do is be able to assess the difference. The capacity was what we're measuring with the PICO 6, and we are measuring their capability during the run or bike test. So that's extremely important to look at, is capacity versus capability. If it's a capacity issue, you must train the capacity. If it's capability, you must train the capability. So just so everybody understands, I do a 515 protocol. You can see this gentleman with the Moxy data up, as well as the FitMate attached to his visage, and the FitMate actually on the table besides for people that have never seen that before. I use a 515 times 4 sets, but I switched to a 313 or less times 1 set because 515 doesn't necessarily make a hell of a lot of sense to me if I'm supposed to be pushing them into zone 4. They shouldn't be able to do it for a 515. So what I try and do is push them into 17 or above on the Bohr RPE scale, and try and hold them for at least for 3 minutes or less. I allow them to be able to go 3 or 2. I need to push them into there to see the effects on SMO2 and total hemoglobin on the Moxy. So from the FitMate Pro, the information that I get is VO2, which is, of course, is measured in milliliters of O2 per kilogram per minute. Respiratory frequency is measured off this device as well, which is, of course, we represented by RF from now on, and that's in breaths per minute. It measures minute volume expressed as VE, and that's the volume per minute moved in liters. And of course, it also measures FeO2, which is the fractional content of expiratory oxygen. What we look at with this is essentially 21% on Earth minus their FeO2 will give you an idea of what O2 is being kept at the lung. And I like to differentiate between what happens between the face and the lung and the hemoglobin loading at the lung, the travel from there to the limb, and then, of course, the transfer, the extraction, and the use at the limb itself. So it's a measure of efficiency of extracting oxygen at the lung by looking at FeO2, and it can be affected by hemoglobin. So if the hemoglobin itself is not effective, let's say they have a low iron, you can see issues with being able to transfer the O2 across the hemoglobin, or metabolic utilization. If they have poor utilization, you'll see things like the FeO2 will stay high because of the fact that there's no hemoglobin to bond to. So the O2 comes and it leaves. So just to give you an idea, this is on the VO2 profile that we provide to people, and what we look at is I do not use VO2 for zoning. So just for those that are interested in VO2 max, I write it down. I don't tell my clients. I don't want them using it. So I definitely don't use it for zoning because for various reasons, but the Moxy is so damn good at it that I don't use it for zoning. I don't provide the athlete or VO2 max, anaerobic threshold, or lactate thresholds, never discussed. In fact, I do my best to try and stay away from those discussions completely. I do use it as a measure of efficiency by checking it as a test or retest, so that you can look at their metabolic efficiency or the VO2 efficiency over time. Plus, I can compare improvements secondary to training. And the reason why I don't use VO2 max or anaerobic threshold or lactate threshold is, you know, my years of experience with this just shows that we're guessing, and I don't like doing math on what I would consider, you know, a normal response to exercise stress. I don't see a need for it, so therefore I don't promote it. It takes a lot to convince people not to want to use the numbers. For the benefit of everyone, I thought it'd be beneficial for you guys to see what I hand out to my clients post-test. So I'll take you through some of the results sheets that I provide. On the zone sheet, I do provide, for example, this person's FVC 6-second volume is 5.71 liters. They can move 4.69 liters in the first 1 second, or 82%, which would be, these are all very good numbers themselves. So we look and say, okay, he has great capacity, but the issue, does he have great capability? And what we can do from there is we can define exactly what he needs to be able to work on from that perspective. we provide them their zones as well as their wattages for their zones. And that, of course, the wattages I tell them very clearly are only specific to my testing device and should not be used for their training. But I do tend to use their zones to be able to extrapolate to be giving things like HIIT protocols. I can generally find a good wattage point for long intervals sitting between, let's say, around 250 watts, and for short intervals would be about 120% of 250 watts. So it does provide me with some means of designing their HIIT protocols based upon their zone results. So it also identifies their limitation, which is, in this particular case, was obviously utilization for all of us that have used Moxy for the last 3 to 5 years. And on the next sheet, they're provided their VO2 profile, their Moxy results, and everybody's used to these, so I'm not going to go through this, but I mean, it's fun to look at. This gentleman, just so you have a look at, is an elite track cyclist. Hard to believe. We also present VO2, and in this particular case, you can see the VO2 is in a percentage. So as we discussed, 21% minus what they're breathing out, their VO2, and you can see this person's breathing out about 16.5% in zone 1, and then in zone 2, holding around 16.75%. So basically, almost not extracting any oxygen off at the lung, and there's a clear reason why I'll cover a little later about why that's happening. Provide a heart rate profile. Again, these used to be interesting in the old days, but I am, in the last 6 weeks, I've caught an electrical issue and a leak in the last 6 weeks, in which Holter testing is proven to be the same, and one is having, or both of them are having surgeries. One's a mitral valve prolapse, and one was an electrical issue, so they're having a pacemaker put in. I provide the respiratory results. So in this particular case, we provide VE, or their minute volume, respiratory frequency, as well as their tidal volume. So their breaths per minute, the volume per breath, as well as their volume per minute is provided. And I'll go more in depth with this. We also provide a VO2 results, and for this particular one, but the VO2 is in, we relate it to other systems. So what we want to be able to do with VO2 is have a look at it in relation to, for example, heart rate. So as heart rate is going up, for every beat that you're increasing, what is the response as far as your efficient use of oxygen? We do the same thing with the VO2 per respiratory frequency. Here in the blue is their ability to utilize oxygen per breath, which is a really interesting take on things, and I find that now that I'm using it more and more and I'm able to look at it over time, I can make really strong training recommendations as far as the respiratory component is concerned, and as far as, for example, if they have poor efficiency in zone 3-4, I can really work those with HIIT protocols, long intervals, and some tempo work itself, which will clean that up over time as well. The other thing we do here is to look at their tidal volume divided by their FEV1. In other words, their volume that they move, their capability divided by their capacity, and it should be between 60 and 75%. And it's represented on this side by the percentage. So as you can see, this gentleman here starts off breathing at about 30% of his capacity, and brings himself up to just barely 60% as he goes through the test itself, which is extremely poor. So there's some good low-hanging fruit, but if you look at his efficiency over time, this gentleman actually improves his ability to use oxygen throughout the test in relation to his respiratory frequency as well as in relation to his heart rate. He at least maintains. As far as I also send out a report card. I developed this in the last 2 weeks because people weren't, it was just too much damn information for them. So I figured I would present them with a report card, which divides it into respiratory supply, cardiac supply, metabolic for extraction and utilization, and then a muscle strength component. And I provide them how we're measuring it, a description of those measures, a set of norms that we're looking for, their results, and a grade score, as well as for each of the grade scores, if they score a C or a D, then what we do is we make a selection from the training options available specific to that limitation, and this helps them stay focused on that. The report card has been extremely popular, that's for sure. Every 4 to 6 weeks I demand performance lines in which they complete their 5-1-5, but they only do 5 minutes of work at each of the wattages or speeds that they were tested at, and every 6 weeks they send me their averaged heart rate in the last 1 minute, and we plot it against to ensure that we're getting improvement through all zones. And if we find, for example, that we're doing a lot of work on HIT and we're seeing a good move on the zone 3, zone 4, but we're seeing this starting to come together in zone 1, 2, then what we'll do is we may expand their zone 2 work and open that up a little bit more. So it gives me a good comparison to do every 6 weeks, and really easy to do. All they do is send you an email and you import it to Excel and send it back to them as ping, and everything's good. So that takes you through the actual testing procedure that I use with my guys. Now to take you through the VO2 profile, as I stated, we look at VO2 based upon the heart rate changes over time, as well as in comparison with the respiratory frequencies over time. And what we're looking at is efficiency to other systems' capabilities. The efficiency should stay the same if they have a good metabolic system as well, and whether they've trained and whether they're efficient. So it's looking, it could be any one of the efficiencies, whether it's neuromuscular or whether it's metabolic itself, in comparison to the supply systems of the heart and the lung. So if we look right here, we can see the VO2 profile here. The efficiency drops significantly about the same time as the individual's volume starts to drop. So remember, this is the volume percentage. We try and get them to hold somewhere between 60 and 75%, and you see this person does extremely well and just loses their volume at the end. But this is an indication of a limiter was respiratory deficiency. Non-limiter was cardiac, because you can see the cardiac was moving along just fine as far as its efficiency, and this turns out to be training focused. At this particular point, we need to do zone 3, zone 4 HIT, high intensity work, as well as what we did was we worked Spirotagger at high respiratory frequencies, so we can get him to be able to maintain his volumes and bring down some of his respiratory frequency while maintaining his VE. And all of this would end up with better efficiency itself. So here's a good example of good efficiency. Basically what we're looking for is the ability to maintain the ability to use oxygen to be throughout the entire test. So it's really easy to pick up any drops where you can do any specific training to be able to deal with that region where the efficiency drops. And you can change the efficiency over time. So here's a VO2 comparison between two tests, and you can see that this is a female Canadian Armed Forces triathlete, competed in the World Military Games as our primary triathlete. She does respiratory training and deficit-specific training. So whatever we find is the deficit, she works on that. And in fact, she just came first at the Canadian Armed Forces Triathlon Championships, so she'll be representing Canada again this year. And you can see a massive change in her efficiency. She's gone from about 30 all the way up to 130 as far as her ability to use oxygen. And if you look at her percentages, she was using about 30% of her capacity as far as her tidal volumes, and she's gone all the way up into where we want that 60 to 75%. And that's improved significantly even more with more respiratory training. you can see as far as the cardiac efficiency related to VO2 is also improved. So it's an interesting way of looking at things when you have that VO2 comparison graph and you have the VO2 data.
Hey, Daniel, I'm going to jump in here. We're a little bit over halfway through our time. We've had a couple of questions come in from the first part of your presentation. So the first one, is the zone 1 through 4 system correlated to heart rate zones, or is it just Moxy zones?
Yeah, it's Moxy, but yeah, yes, I do deliver it as a heart rate zone.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the other question we've got, and maybe this will be coming up ahead, is why not use VO2 alone?
Again, just looking for a rapid increase in respiratory frequency to indicate, let's say, anaerobic threshold. That's a normal response to moving into a zone. Great. It indicates that the respiratory frequency is in response to elevated CO2 levels and acidosis. Great. That's fine. I don't need to do math on that to be able to find accurate zoning. And that's my issue, is it just doesn't, it marks one change, a change of fuel systems, and that's all it marks. And I much prefer the Moxy to be able to do that. I've never found anything to work as well for marking changes of zones than Moxy.
Okay, great. Well, it's about 11:28 right now, so we've got 22, 23 more minutes here, so you can pace yourself for the rest of the presentation. Then we'll take a little bit of time at the end for some more questions.
Thank you very much. All right, so just to give you an idea of respiratory performance. So this person here, this is a poor respiratory performance. When you look at their ability to breathe per breath versus, so capability versus capacity of what they can get out in 1 second. And what we look for is around 60 to 75% of their FEV1 they should be able to move in their tidal volumes. And you see this person, first of all, breathes 1 depth the entire time. And they only move about 35 to 40% of their capacity. So this is one of those ones where you go, great low-hanging fruit. Their efficiency is fairly good. So we're going to work on respiratory endurance and be able to get them to be able to use a larger portion of their capacity. And we can easily, I can easily move people from 40% to 60 to 75% in a matter of 8 to 12 weeks. And obviously that makes a slight difference. More O2 is never a problem, never a bad thing. So I'm going to remind everybody of the function of the respiratory system. So it's to provide a continuous and adequate supply of O2, also removing CO2, as well as maintaining the biochemistry, the pH of the body, assist in control of body temperature, as well as core stability. And for those people, the core stability one is extremely interesting, that I work on a lot because of the fact that as a sport physiotherapist, when I get somebody with a neuromuscular limitation, I don't bother doing physiological testing on them because I already know what their limiter is. So instead, what I do find is, and I'm sure as you guys do, is that most people with repetitive stress injuries have problems after about an hour of running or an hour of cycling. You should consider the fact that if they have a poor endurance in the respiratory system, their core stability will be shot after about 1 hour of respiratory work. And therefore, they'll have decreased control, and therefore there'll be more symptoms that will pop up at the peripheries because of the fact that they're unable to maintain their core stability. The respiratory system will work on providing O2 and say, oh, screw it to core stability, and you'll find that their form will drop, and therefore they'll start to have all that patellofemoral pain or iliotibial band friction syndrome, all those other issues. And not forgetting that your guys that compete in high temperatures, that the respiratory system will be taxed even further in those situations. We tend to think of that in a nutrition hydration side of the house, but it's also important to realize that that's an additional stress on the respiratory system itself. The one thing that I do, I don't ever see anybody breathe too slowly. Actually, I've seen a couple of senior cyclists that I've had to actually get to speed up their breathing in zone 3 and 4, but a majority of my guys are all about hyperventilation. So I just want to remind you that the effects of hyperventilation is it decreases your carbon dioxide levels, leads to vasodilation of the blood vessels, which leads to decreased volume return to the heart, which leads to decreased stroke volume and decreased cardiac output and decreased performance. So there's a cardiovascular effect of hyperventilation, but there's also a metabolic effect, whereas low CO2 levels will lead to increased adherence of O2 to the total hemoglobin, as we talk about the O2 dissociation curve moving to the left, and decreased ability of the cellular structures to then extract the O2 from the hemoglobin, and that will lead to decreased performance as well. So it's important to understand that hyperventilation affects not only the respiratory, but the metabolic, but also the cardiovascular system itself. So we have the Bohr effect is really what we're talking about here, and of course it's meant to do great things. It increases the efficiency of O2 transportation through the blood, and the oxygen binding affinity is inversely related to your acidity and the concentration of carbon dioxide. So obviously when you're dropping your carbon dioxide levels with hyperventilation, will have an effect on this situation. And an increase in blood CO2 concentration leads to a decrease in blood pH and the hemoglobin proteins releasing the load of O2. And conversely, if you blow off too much CO2, it actually causes the hemoglobin to pick up more oxygen. But the issue is the affinity leads to the inability at a metabolic level to pull the O2 off the hemoglobin. So if we talk about that, the effects of hyperventilation on circulation and normal gas exchange, you'll see what will happen is we get a decrease in O2 delivery through constriction of the arteries and arterioles, and then you get a suppressed Bohr effect, and what happens is you get a major decrease of O2 and CO2 at the brain level, which we tend to forget, which affects mental ability, so that ability to make good decisions during a race, especially in things like mountain biking where it could be a life and death situation. It strongly makes that effect. And then of course you get a dilation of the venous system, so you get a decreased return of the blood to the heart, and therefore you'll see a drop in your total hemoglobin as well. So hyperventilation has such a profound effect on all systems that if you're not monitoring it, and that's one of the issues we have with the Moxy, it doesn't give you the ability to be able to monitor hyperventilation. This is a great example of 1 minute of hyperventilation and the effects on blood delivery to the brain. This is a demonstration of vasoconstriction at the brain after 1 minute of hyperventilation due to a lack of carbon dioxide. And you can see this is probably not a great thing to do to yourself while you're trying to make decisions while you're doing a downhill portion of a mountain bike race. There's other effects of hypocapnia or low CO2 levels. It include muscle fatigue, cramping, decreased coordination, decreased reaction time, loss of focus, and anxiety, none of which are an advantage to the athlete. So it's well worth, hopefully I've driven home the point of the importance of monitoring VO2 is actually looking at a lot of the data that people throw out when they do VO2 and VO2 maxes, which is paying attention to how they get their VE and only paying attention to their VO2 max number when it comes out the other end. In a lot of cases, you'll see with VO2 maxes that almost nobody does pulmonary function tests beforehand to be able to determine their capability versus capacity, which I think is just such a huge loss. Here's a couple of quotes I'll let you read through on the effects of hypocapnia. All right. A little bit of research on respiratory training. For some reason, people think it's still controversial, which it's not. Studies indicate that exercise does induce respiratory muscle fatigue. It can limit exercise performance. It can be trained, and that training can enhance exercise performance. Nice and crystal clear. There's also changes in breathing patterns can affect respiratory muscle fatigue, are reversed after respiratory endurance training. So extremely important to understand that once you identify they have a respiratory supply issue, you can actually do something about it. Great study on respiratory muscle training, looking at, has a positive influence on exercise performance both during moderate fixed intensity exercise tasks and simulated time trials ranging from 6 minutes to 1 hour. And it has a beneficial influence even on that group of less than 6 minutes on the recovery time between repetitive sprint tests themselves. And it's credited towards direct effect of respiratory muscle training upon respiratory muscle fatigue. Indirect effects including improving blood flow distribution, as we were discussing earlier, through that vasoconstriction, vasodilation effect to the limb. And it also has direct and indirect effects upon the intensity that are perceived respiratory and peripheral efforts by the individual. And that's one of the things I hear the most is when people come in and I ask them what they think their limiter is and they say respiratory, and I find a respiratory, then we can easily improve their perceived limitation to that, and the next thing you know, they don't even remember the last time that they felt their respiratory system was their limiter. Here's a good study on well-trained swimmers. I've often felt that swimming would be benefited by respiratory muscle training, and they did 8-week RMAT program with the same training sessions 5 to 6 times per week, and they found that the ventilatory function parameters, chest expansion, respiratory muscle strength and endurance, and performances were all improved only in the RMAT group, and the perceived exertion and dyspnea were lower in the RMAT group in both trials at 50 and 200 meters. So a profound effect on swimmers, and of course some of our other group, some of our fit young cyclists, so this is from 2004, they took 20 fit, so an average of VO2 of 56. Experienced cyclists, divided them into 3 groups. Placebo group went through a sham training, and the control group did no additional training, but they all had the same training protocol. And the experimental group with the RMAT increased the respiratory muscle endurance capacity by 12% over that period of time. And they also improved, there were no improvements in the other group at all in respiratory muscle or exercise endurance performance, but the experimental group had significantly higher ventilatory output and VO2 and lower PCO2, whereas the other groups did not. So it's an amazing tool if you're not currently using it, but of course you can't use it unless you test it, so this is where the FitMate and VO2 testing comes in addition to Moxy. So here's a presentation of kind of a classic, what Moxy would state as a classic respiratory supply limitation. Drops in SMO2 at the beginning of each rest cycle, indicating a supply limitation, and of course a poor SMO2 loading during the rests themselves, which could be a myriad of things, not just a supply limitation. So that's the issue that I have with it, is let's not extrapolate too much, it's because otherwise you're just guessing. So it's important that you stay concrete in what your findings are. But this is what I think we'd all consider to be a classic representation of a respiratory supply limitation. When we look at respiratory performance using the VO2 data, what you see here is the respiratory frequencies are in red here across the bottom. You can see in here that this person has a gradual increase in their respiratory frequencies throughout the test, ranging from around 20 breaths per minute all the way through to 50 breaths per minute. And what we try and do is we try and be zone specific with them. So if they're breathing in zone 1 versus 2 versus 3, there should be a range of frequencies that they should be using. So what we use in general is in zone 1 we're looking for about 18 to 22 RF, zone 2 somewhere between 20 and 30, 30 to 40, and 40 to 55, and zone 4, 4 plus. I generally don't talk zone 5, I usually just talk about the short intervals will be in the higher end of zone 4 and longer intervals on the lower end of zone 4. So this is actually a really good performance looking at respiratory frequency, using it as as a tool throughout to be able to gradually increase O2 delivery. If we look at tidal volumes, what we look for in here is in green, the tidal volume coming across. This person's moving somewhere between 2.5 and 3 liters per breath. And what we're looking for is 60 to 75%, as we stated before, of their forced expiratory volume in 1 second. And we were looking for higher volumes at the lower frequencies. This makes perfect sense. They should be able to go deeper when they're breathing slower. And then as their frequencies go up, we ask them to try and maintain that 60% level and go maybe to a 75% in this area here. So in an ideal situation, this is actually really quite good. I'd be very happy with this. And then we also look at VE, and obviously my concern here is VE is looked at as VE and as VE. There's good VE and there's bad VE. Low volumes and high frequencies, VE is bad VE. And anybody who gives me VE without tidal volumes or respiratory frequencies, I don't trust it. I have no idea how they got it, and that's a big warning to everyone out there on VE. Minute volume is not an indication of efficient breathing. And this cat here is kicking around, almost 120 liters. We're looking where the VE should be about 75%. So of their FEV1 at a respiratory frequency of about 50, because this is where we kind of promote. It'll give you a estimate of their capability anyway, to see whether they're actually their capability matches their capacity or not. So here's a graph which shows a clear respiratory limitation, so it drops in SMO2 at least in the first 3 steps, and the concurrent graph from the respiratory data from this individual. So you can see very clear this person's zone 1. In fact, there's zone 1 here as well. And you can see here, despite being in zone 1, the person's breathing around 40 breaths a minute, which is absolutely ridiculous. There's absolutely no need for it, and they're blowing off huge amounts of carbon dioxide, which again will have those profound effects on the ability at the metabolic level of the ability for the O2 to be extracted at the cell, as well as it will strongly affect the blood flow being delivered through the THB on the SMO2. So this looks really good. When you look at this data, you go, yes, I see it here, and I see it here. And really poor VO2 or poor VE here, moving about 70 liters here, and no drive to drive their tidal volumes up at all. In fact, you'll see that reverse curve where they actually go after the volume at the end, despite the fact that they're breathing 55 breaths a minute here. This is the deepest volume they have. So this is just a bad capability. This is an issue that needs to be trained. But the problem is that sometimes I see these drops here and almost through the first 5 portions of the test at the beginning of each one that would indicate a respiratory limitation, but this person has absolutely amazing ability to breathe. There is no respiratory limitation here. The person has a gradual increase. Their VE is almost 180, and their depth of their breath is somewhere between 3 and 4 liters per breath. There is no respiratory limitation here, despite the fact that it's showing up on the Moxy graph. So sometimes it just doesn't. I think at times it's a nice thing to look at, but without the VO2 data, you're going to be fooled. And this is not what's actually going on here. And here's another example. For example, the same gentleman here, but this is their VO2 data, and you can see the person's is moving between 60 and 80% of their capacity, and there's no way this person has a respiratory limitation, supply limitation at these points. Now here's another example where you see the FitMate identifies a respiratory limitation, breathing 40 breaths a minute in zone 1. This is zone 2, obviously, and breathing almost into 40, 50 breaths a minute at these points with a tiny volume itself. So moving 2 liters, moving up to 3 liters, and a VO2 of 40. But because of the respiratory frequencies, the person has a legitimate respiratory limitation because of their capacity or the capability, but it just doesn't show up here at all. And this is the same data here. If you look at their actual VO2, you can see they were actually only moving 25 to 35 or 40% of their capacity on the VO2, and yet nothing shows up on this side. So I don't trust respiratory limitations to be identified on the Moxy. One of the things that is really cool when you're looking at other parts of what comes off of your VO2 data is poor utilization of the muscle. So this person obviously leaving 70% bonded onto the hemoglobin despite hitting zone 4 here. There's no space for the hemoglobin for O2 to load. So what will happen is their FeO2 will stay extremely high. So this person, despite this is zone 1 and zone 2, they're leaving 16 to 16.5% of their oxygen. They're breathing out 16 to 16.5%. It's not because of their respiratory limitation, but because of the fact that their utilization is so poor. There's no transfer of O2 at the lung onto the hemoglobin because the hemoglobins are arriving loaded. So this is a very interesting other thing I pick up that actually shows improvement over time. So here's an example of poor FeO2. This person is sitting at 16.5%, above almost 17% to 17.5% in zone 1s and 2s, and no ability to breathe. And this is actually was a limitation at the lung. I've also seen this sometimes when you see these 70% during recoveries, there's an assumption that it's a respiratory limitation because there's the drops, but the problem is it doesn't transfer at the lung. It's not an issue specifically with the respiratory system as a whole, but this individual actually has lung damage secondary to an asbestos injury. So you'll see you can get all kinds of different SMO2 data without the VO2 data. You're not sure. I also see this significantly with nutritional limitations as well. So that ability to bond secondary to, let's say, depleted iron levels themselves. So it's really important that we look at both aspects and see whether they align to be able to get the real answer. FeO2 can improve, as here's a clear example of the initial utilization dropping to maybe 76% on the first test, and on the second test dropping to 60%. And you can see that because of this, they're able to now extract more oxygen off at the lungs, so the FeO2 actually drops. And that's exactly what we're looking for as another indication of improved efficiency. Here's a respiratory frequency issue that you wouldn't normally pick up, and this is a real, I like to put this in that this person has he breathes 45 breaths a minute all the way through, and then increases to about 60 breaths per minute. For all those coaches out there that are trying to teach their runners or cyclists to breathe on a cadence, please stop doing that. This is exactly what it looks like. And there's no ability for them to respond to the biochemical requirements of the effort if they're forcing themselves to breathe every second breath and every third breath, or every step, second step or third step. And so this is an example of some bad recommendations by coaching.
Daniel, I'll just jump in here. It's about 11:50 now, so why don't we try and get this wound up in about the next 5 minutes, if that works for you?
You got it.
All right.
All right. I'm going to skip through a few. As I stated, the respiratory limitations, majority of the times, have to do with expiration. And these devices only train inspiration and have a limit of 30 to 50 breaths. And obviously, our endurance athletes need a little bit more than that. So Though I'm familiar with them, I use them on hockey players and football players, but I do not use them on endurance athletes, so I don't recommend them to others. Instead, what I use is SpiroTiger training. So it trains inspiration and expiration, and you can focus it on whatever particular limitation that they have, whether it's coordination, strength, volume, endurance, or even pre-post race. This is a gentleman who just finished 44th at the World Snowshoe Championships warming up pre-race. We can use positional challenges, and we also can make it functional to ensure application, meaning that they do it before each time that they train at the volume and frequency that we're promoting them to use during that zone work. So here's an example of a respiratory limitation here. So this is an improvement on respiratory using SpiroTiger, an improvement of tidal volume and VE. So as you can see, this is their initial tidal volume was around 2 liters. We increased this person's up to 3.5 liters. It's not sorted out the way I would like it 100%, so we're working on getting this end a little higher. But as you can see, that's a massive increase in volume and a concurrent increase from approximately under 100 liters to over about 160 liters per minute improvement. And here's an example of a beautiful change in respiratory frequencies where a person was breathing 40 breaths per minute. We worked on neuromuscular coordination, and this person now has what we would consider beautiful RF here. What with a concomitant increase in tidal volumes resulting in about the same VE, but good VE, not bad VE. So my mission end state was to review all my testing procedures, understand zoning with Moxy, not with VO2. And for the reason why it's accurate, and doing math on a number, I have no idea why people would do that when you can actually see the changes with O2 delivery directly at the limb. Analyze both with Moxy and VO2 if you want a real picture of what's going on. Otherwise, there's too much extrapolation off the Moxy data that shouldn't be done. It's extremely good at what it does, and shouldn't be forced to provide information that's not really there. And respiratory limitations are real, and as I demonstrated, they're extremely trainable, and you can have profound effects on people's performance.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That was a great presentation. We'll just take a minute here for one question. And this is one we'd actually talked about earlier. What is the training effect or what is the primary training effect of respiratory training?
Let's see if I can go up here. I kind of skipped through that one. Here's an example. So SpiroTiger, what are you training? So for example, a gentleman that would have, let's say, low forced vital capacity during the pulmonary function test has a capacity issue. In that particular case, we'll be working on a strength volume program, so trying to increase their FBC. And we combine that with manual therapy and a home exercise program for T-spine and rib mobility, working on neuromuscular strength. So we would get them to move through ranges of motion while doing the SpiroTiger to really try and get thoracic extension rotation through the ribs, open up the ribs to increase their FBC. So if that's the goal, great, this is what we would do if that was their limitation. On the capability side, let's say they have a good FBC, but we notice that their percentages during the bike or run test is really low, like 30 to 40%. Then what we would do is endurance or zone-specific respiratory frequency programs. So, for example, let's say they have a really hard time maintaining volume in zone 3 or 4. We would promote that 30 to 50 breaths per minute at the volume that we wish them to have over a 20 to 30 minute workout. And then prior to each time they go out to train zone 3 or 4, we would get them to do 10 minutes of breathing at the correct volume at the right frequencies to be able to transfer that into their training session functionally. And then we would combine manual therapy, etc., if it was required. So you can use it for a myriad of things. You're training strength, endurance, neuromuscular input, thoracic and rib mobility, So a myriad of things depending on, you're going to train whatever's limited is the answer.
All right, great, great discussion. So thanks so much again for that wonderful presentation. This will get posted online and in our forum. We're out of time for today, so if there's any additional questions or discussion, please post them on the forum, and Daniel will follow up from there. So thanks everyone for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.